Welcome to Rick and Bubba University, the podcast. We're excited today. I mean, when you get to talk to a man like Ken Khachigian and the things that he has heard, the things that he has done, Bubba, today we're talking with Ken, who's written the book Behind Closed Doors. So it's a memoir. He worked closely with both Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. Keep in mind that he's gone through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. But when you get to the end of the book, and we won't give it away, he spent close to a decade and a half kind of being a confidant and keeping in touch with both of these famous presidents. But in 1990, Reagan and Nixon were actually together, and they sat down and they were just chatting about history and all the things they had gone through, and Ken kept notes of the conversation, and he will reveal that in his memoir called Behind Closed Doors, in the Room with Reagan and Nixon. So Ken, I'm going to say it again, Ken Khachigian. You just act like you're sneezing, right? Isn't that what you said?
That's right, Khachigian. That's right.
Hey, Ken.
Yeah, exactly right.
So, Ken, thank you for joining us.
Ken, a lot of history there. I mean, you've been there at some big moments.
I don't look that old, do I?
No, you really don't. You really don't. I bet your biological age is younger than ours.
Yeah.
Probably combined.
Yeah. Well, this is just, and we have so much to work through, but I want to ask this. Have you seen the Dennis Quaid Reagan movie?
I have indeed. I sat next to John Voight watching that movie.
Well,
really?
Your thoughts, based on your expertise, did that capture that era?
Well, that was a good dramatization. Hollywood always is based on compressing a lot of stuff into a short period of time. But Dennis Quaid did a really nice job trying to capture President Reagan. You can't, movies can't precisely capture human life because it dramatizes it. But the movie is a nice return to nostalgia. And Quaid did a really wonderful job, I must say. And people need to go see the movie. And Penelope Ann Miller captured, I think she captured Nancy Reagan, the role, the way they played her role in the movie captured her role in the presidency and in Reagan's life really, really well. I think that was the scripting did a good job. John Voight's presence in the movie, which was a dramatization, was done. Boy, that guy can really act.
Yeah, he can.
He did really, really well. And there was another scene in the movie where I happen to know precisely what happened, where Lady Thatcher counseled Reagan in terms of the advance of the Geneva Summit in 1985, because I worked on that speech that he gave prior to that Geneva Summit, because I knew all the facts about that one, and that was very accurate. So a lot of the movie is dramatization and Hollywood, but a lot of it captures a lot of the Reagan presidency in his life. So I think people need to go see it and get a feel-good feeling about what happened during the Reagan years. And I'd say, all in all, it's a nice time to go see the movie.
Ken, I kind of want to start with Reagan because, of course, we remember Nixon, but we grew up more in the Reagan era, and I got to cast my first vote for president for Reagan. He had a unique ability to speak to the people and kind of cut through the politics and the haze and everything was out there. And ever since then, I think a lot of people, all the politicians that have come along who are conservative or Republican, they get compared to Reagan. I think we all want the second coming of Reagan, and all of them have fallen short. Yep. But was that ability to speak to people, was that just something he had? And how did it come about? I mean, he obviously lost the nomination to Gerald Ford the first time around, and I can't help but think how history might have been changed if he had been there earlier. But did he always have that ability?
Well, he did. He connected with people really well, and that had to do with his the way he grew up, small town America, small town roots, Dixon, Illinois. And there's something that people forget about Reagan that's unique to his being able to capture people and connect with their minds, and that is he grew up in the age of radio. Now, you fellows you probably don't know what a radio looks like.
Oh, we
Bubba,
do. Yeah,
sure.
yeah, we do.
yeah, Bubba, you didn't grow up listening to radio like I did. I never saw a television set till I was about 8 years old, and so I listened to radio growing up on Saturdays. Listened to Hopalong Cassidy and Lone Ranger and stories about princes and princesses and so Reagan grew up in the age of radio, and he was a radio announcer. So his life before Hollywood was capturing people's minds by creating word pictures. So that was one of his great skills in communication, was being able to paint word pictures in their head. And he learned that very early in his life and created a great communication skill on his part. And of course, once he got into the movies and learned how to read a script and learned how to act and make eye contact and had that, and of course, that wonderful winning smile of his. So you combine all that and then, and of course, don't rule out the fact that man had great ideas.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And you have to add that to the equation. He had wonderful ideas, and he conveyed great ideas to the American people. Freedom, hope, enterprise, and the fact that you can achieve great things when you give people freedom.
What a concept. So
Yeah.
it sounds like our founding fathers. So let me ask you this, Ken. So there was no doubt that he recognized the dangers of communism.
Yes.
And in that, in the movie, they portrayed that he really felt that he was born, and that God had put him in that position to stop the spread of communism around the world. Did you get that passion from him as his speechwriter? I mean, he certainly loved you as a speechwriter. He made that very clear. You were his favorite. And I think one of the reasons, as I say, when I was reading up on you, is that he felt like you knew how to capture his true voice. I don't think anybody wants to give a speech that they're like, this doesn't sound like me. So in your time with him, did you sense that he felt that call in his life?
Well, he had let me put it this way. He had a passion. He had a passion coming into the presidency, and during the campaign, when I campaigned with him in 1980, he had a passion to bring a crusade into the White House to lift the oppressiveness of the government off the backs of the American people, the oppressiveness of taxes, the oppressiveness of government regulation, the way the government is trying to control the lives of the American people and telling them what to do. And the fact that the tax system and the regulatory policies in America, and that was, it wasn't, America was not a communist country. America was not a totalitarian country, but he felt it was heading down the road to where the government was more and more taking over the lives of the American people. And to the extent that the government was taking over the lives of the American people, it was akin to the system that you saw in other regimes, where they were being oppressive and taking over the rights and freedoms of the people. And the more and more they took those rights away, you lifted the possibility of people to free themselves up to do the things that we did so wonderfully in this country and grow and provide people opportunity like you and I know that grew the country and made it wealthy and provided wealth for the average person. You could be born the poorest person in the world and then be like a Steve Jobs and create a wonderful empire like Apple, or be a Henry Ford and invent an automobile, or be Orville and Wilbur Wright and create an airplane. You can't do that anywhere else.
Ken, what I referred a minute ago when Gerald Ford got the nomination, I guess it was 76, and Reagan gave a speech at the convention trying to unite the Republicans for Gerald Ford. And I think at that time is the first time I heard people saying, we nominated the wrong guy.
Yeah,
we just made a mistake, because that was the first time I noticed Reagan giving a speech that I thought, wow, this is different. This is a different deal. How did he deal with not winning that time? How did that affect him or motivate him to run again?
Well, I think that he had an ability to look ahead. I don't think he was bitter. I think Nancy was really, Mrs. Reagan, Nancy was very, very disappointed, feeling that the country had made a mistake. But he was a relatively young man. He was only 65 years old then, and I think that's pretty young these days.
I do now.
and he still had young ideas, and he had a lot of vigor. He was a very healthy man. He was an athletic person, and so he didn't see it as the end of his career, and he saw opportunities yet ahead. So he didn't see it as the end of his life or the end of his career, and he still had a radio show and an opportunity to move forward. And when it was looked very likely that Ford was going to lose, and Ford nearly pulled it out because Jimmy Carter was so stupid and dumb and incapable. I mean, the fact that he could barely run a state in Georgia and didn't know how to run the campaign and the government, as we found out. But Carter barely won and gave Reagan another opportunity. So he was able to move on. And, I write in the book about Reagan's sense of optimism, and we had long meetings. That's what I want people to read the book for is the long conversations I had with Reagan that no one else had. No one else had these conversations or made notes on them or wrote them down. In several chapters of the book about his theory of economics and theory of freedom and theory of capitalism and the crusade he brought to America, and his great sense of hope and enterprise. And that sense of hope was permeated his thinking, and I think it permeated it in 1977 and 78 when he decided, I can do this again.
We'll come back. We'll continue our conversation. The book we speak of is Behind Closed Doors, in the Room with Reagan and Nixon, and we'll continue our conversation when Rick and Bubba University, the podcast, continues right after this.
This is the Rick and Bubba Show. Watch more at blazetv.com/Rick and Bubba.
Rick and Bubba, Rick and Bubba.
Ken Khachigian, there it is again. I said it again.
Well, that's a toughie.
Ken K. Is author of the book Behind Closed Doors, in the Room with Reagan and Nixon. Spent time 60s, 70s, 80s, and then sat in on a conversation in 1990 with both Reagan and Nixon. These conversations at length. Speechwriter, Reagan's favorite speechwriter. He helped write some of Reagan's most famous speeches. So when you look at the two, Ken, Nixon, Reagan, talk to us a little bit. You worked with both, the differences, the things that were similar. Tell us about that a little bit, since you were involved in both.
Well, they were similar in that they were both very deep thinkers. Nixon was a very deep thinker in the sense that every conversation I had with him, many which I record in the book, with the notes I kept in diaries in 4 years of meetings with him in San Clemente. And then over the years, we stayed in touch over 15, 20 years. I can't get the exact number of all the years we stayed in touch so close together on phone calls and those meetings in San Clemente where we stayed in touch. But we had long conversations about everything, world affairs. When you sat down with Nixon, he dropped names like de Gaulle and Churchill and Indira Gandhi and Golda Meir and And Dwight Eisenhower. So those were very substantial. And we talk about economics and politics. And he was a very deep thinker about foreign policy and economic policy in the 60s and 70s. And so he was always a very deep thinker. And the sessions we'd have about politics, the strategies he had, and maybe mistakes he made in the 60s and that he could have done differently. And all those were very profound. And so the same thing with Reagan. Reagan was also a very deep thinker. And I record that in those very serious conversations we had about the economy. People think maybe that Reagan was always just an actor, and he never used a teleprompter.
Sure.
When he spoke out in great rallies. Like his inaugural address, he didn't use a teleprompter. He just spoke from notes. So in those conversations we had about the economy, and he felt the American people didn't understand the economy like they should, about the need for freedom and opportunity and cutting back on the government. So they both were very profound and deep thinkers. The big difference is that when you got them away from serious issues of policy, Nixon would love to talk about politics. That was his way of having sort of a BS session. So he'd talk about maybe what Charlie Halleck would do in Indiana back in 1958, or Carl Munton in South Dakota, or why he made a mistake in putting Cabot Lodge on the ticket in 1960. And we talk about strategy for different candidates. With Reagan, we didn't have BS sessions about politics. He might talk about playing a trick on Errol Flynn in the movie Santa Fe Trail, or some conversations he had with Bob Hope or John Wayne. With Reagan, it was less likely to have a regular casual conversation. It was not as easy to get close to Reagan on a personal basis, because while I was one of the very few people on his staff, there was only a handful of us that created a bond with him where he had a comfort level. He didn't let loose with, we didn't sit there and have great long conversations about personal life or things like that, or bull sessions. But with Nixon, you could talk for hours about politics.
You know, the thing about Reagan, I always thought was interesting. When he took over, the country was in a mess economically. We were in a mess internationally with the Russians. They were on the move all over the globe. And he laid out a plan and said, hey, this is what we're going to do. This is how it's going to fix things. And this is going to happen. This is going to happen. And finally, unemployment will come down. Unemployment will come down. Mm-hmm. And it fell and happened just like he said it would. I mean, it was an amazing prediction, I thought, as a young person, because we'd just been through the Carter years where we learned terms like stagnation and malaise. And we couldn't rescue hostages. We couldn't do anything right around the globe. And he just changed everything on a dime. And I guess a lot of that goes back to that optimism that he had.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you a story. Our campaign wasn't doing really well. We had a landslide in 1980. Everybody remembers that we won so easily over Carter. But at this time, at the end of September in 1980, Carter was either tied or ahead of us. We weren't doing so well. And we were sort of treading water. And about the first week of October, we were in Pennsylvania, and I was always struggling for Bubba. I was always struggling for a line to come up with. We had to try to find something that would move the heads of the American people to have them change their mind about the politics of the day. And somewhere I don't know where it came out of nowhere, I came up with this line: Ask yourself, are you better off today than you were in 1976? And that we morphed that a little bit in the next few days, and it changed to, "Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?"
And that said a lot.
That captured
Yep.
everything that you're talking about.
Yep.
So that when he got into the White House, that underscored the crusade. So that the first few days in the cabinet meetings, which I capture in the first chapters of this 1981 administration, he was right on top of those cabinet members. We're going to cut back government. We're going to start cutting the budget. We're going to lower taxes, and we're going to get this country going again, because we're going to lift the government off the backs of the American people, and we're going to put the tax money not back in the government, but back in the hands of people, and let them spend it the way they ought to do it, and not the way the government feels it ought to do it. What a simple proposition!
I know, and then it just explodes from that because there's so much money in play. Let me ask you.
It would work again, by the way.
Yeah, I started to say the line you said. We wish one of the candidates would use that more now, and just say that and be quiet.
Well, I've been trying to, through these various interviews and podcasts, pass the same message on to a certain candidate, that if he passed along that same message today, and if he maybe just have someone on his staff read my book,
right,
that message from 1980 would work well today. And I will tell you another thing that's very interesting about my book is that Richard Nixon was advising Reagan in the 1980 campaign through secret memos that he passed through me. And the memos included strategies comments by Nixon to Reagan, and all the strategy was not on foreign policy. It was about the economy. Nixon said, "You got to stick to the economy, Ron." And there's long memos, and then along the campaign trail, Nixon would call me on the phone and say, "Ken, make sure that Ron sticks to the economy, because that's the stuff that's going to move this campaign." And he would give me ideas and thoughts. So all along the way. So the certain person you're thinking about that we're mutually agreed on, if he would just stick to the economy this year, he could get back into the White House.
No doubt. We'll come back. The book we're speaking of, Behind Closed Doors in the Room with Reagan and Nixon, available now. We'll continue our conversation when Rick and Bubba University, the podcast, continues right after this.
This is the Rick and Bubba Show. Watch more at blazetv.com/Rick and Bubba.
Rick and Bubba, Rick and Bubba.
We're back. Ken Khachigian is our guest, and Ken Khachigian has written the book Behind Closed Doors in the Room with Reagan and Nixon. Ken was there. He wrote for both of them. He was Ronald Reagan's favorite speechwriter. And I want to ask you one more thing, Ken, as we are looking, but I want to go back in history a little bit since you spent time with these two men. Richard Nixon obviously became this cartoonish figure of corruption, and he's a bad guy. Oh, we had to be run out of the White House, Watergate, all this stuff. Of course, we've said on the air the things that happened at Watergate they've been exceeded 10 times in politics today, and nothing happens to anyone.
No, there's no shame.
We would look at Watergate now like it's kindergarten compared to some of the corruption that's going on in administrations, and it seems no one's held accountable. Has history been unfair to Richard Nixon? You can probably speak to that. I'm not talking about on what happened, but just his place in history.
I think there's no question of that. He came into the presidency facing three massive headwinds. People forget that he inherited the war in Vietnam. Guess who left it to him? Jack Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. 540,000 troops in Vietnam, a lot of them from your neck of the woods, Rick and Bubba.
Oh, yeah.
540,000 troops in Vietnam, 500 boys being killed every month, and 1,000 casualties every month. and he inherited that war and all the protests going on across the land. He inherited a partisan Congress. He never had a Republican House or Senate the entire 5.5 years he was in the presidency. And then he also had an adversarial press. He only had 3 networks, 3 news weeklies, and 2 major newspapers, the Times and the Washington Post, all of whom were against him. So if you look at what he achieved in those 5.5 years, given the fact that he got some Supreme Court justices, that he opened the door to China, that he offset the Soviet Union, that he did some very major things like that. He desegregated schools in the South, lowered the voting age to 18. He ended the draft, made an all-volunteer army. He brought in Title IX for the ladies so they could participate in sports, unlike which they couldn't do before that. He initiated welfare reform. So there's a lot of things to his legacy that people need to understand. The other unfair part of Watergate, which they need to understand, is that what we've learned over the years since he's left office, unearthed by my colleague, White House colleague Jeff Shepard, who's become a Watergate scholar, is that the judge who oversaw the Watergate trials was a corrupt judge, Jack Sirica, that he had meetings with the prosecutors without any of the defendants' lawyers in the room. That's unconstitutional violation of the Fifth and Sixth Amendments to the Constitution. It's illegal and unethical. So I could go on and on. I don't want to waste your time doing all that. But the fact is that there's so much more that we need to appreciate about what Nixon achieved in those years when you consider the context in which he was faced.
Exactly.
When he entered the presidency against these terrible, terrible headwinds. So I think history will treat him much, much better. I hope people will consider going to his library, Yorba Linda, where I'm a emeritus director, and I helped found that library. I helped oversee the opening of it, and it's a beautiful library, alongside the Reagan Library as well.
Ken, let me ask you this, and this may be an obvious question, maybe not. When you're talking about Vietnam, we were there just like we were in Korea. We had a general long-standing policy of containment. We figured if we stopped the spread of communism, they would burn themselves out, because we all knew the system could not sustain itself over a long period of time, and our plan was containment. But when you're talking about committing 500,000 U.S. soldiers to a fight in a foreign country that we're not directly threatened from, that's, it can get real unpopular real quick. And of course we saw that. Was there ever any consideration on using nuclear weapons to win that war, end that war quickly, and make our point about the spread of communism?
I don't think the president ever considered using nuclear weapons to end that war. What happened was that at the end of 1968, in an effort to salvage Hubert Humphrey's campaign in October, Lyndon Johnson took away one of the great weapons that Nixon could have used to help end that war quicker, and that is he stopped the bombing in North Vietnam. We were using B-52s and other elements of bombing, their supply lines in North Vietnam. And Johnson said, I'm going to stop the bombing in North Vietnam. Maybe we'll get some peace talks going. Well, it took away one of the great weapons of potential to help end the war more quickly. So when Nixon came into office, Johnson had took away one of the great military tools that Nixon could have used. And so Nixon was left with one way out, and that was to reduce the number of troops in Vietnam steadily to try to get out of that war. At the same time, he was trying to balance off Russia, which had nuclear weapons, and China, which was developing a nuclear policy. And China was a crazed country at that time. China in 1960s was like North Korea is today. It wasn't the country that we think of today where they drive Teslas and eat at McDonald's and drink Starbucks. It was a bunch of nutcases. So he was dealing with a pack of stacked carded decks that Lyndon Johnson left him behind. We had a big mess when we came to office in 1969, Rick and Bubba.
Wow.
I tell you, it was a horror show.
Sounds like it. And then, Reagan in a similar situation, not near as horrible, but still economically terrible when he
Right.
took over. But on that note, with you being a speechwriter, we have all these famous, back over to Reagan now, Reagan moments. Great orator, as we've already established.
Yep.
And you captured his voice. There's all these, and it was in the Reagan movie too, that there were times when his staff would say, "Don't say this."
Mm-hmm.
But Reagan, at the end of it all, tell us about being privy to some of that. If he thought it needed to be said, he would not allow it to be crossed out of the speech. Correct? He took a few stands that his staff thought politically, with public relations, could have been damaging, and he went forward. Is that all accurate?
Oh, I was involved in that deeply in the 1984 campaign.
Yeah.
And then again in 1987 State of the Union, 1988 his farewell address to the convention, but in the 1984 campaign, his chief of staff and the softies around him didn't even want him to mention Mondale's name, and they said, "Oh, we don't want to scare away the Democrats," and they were beating up on Reagan, and Reagan wanted to get tough in that campaign, and finally took Nancy to get this change taking place. So it's when Reagan wanted to put something in and make a change, he was often restricted by his staff, who were weaker and less concerned about, or more concerned about, offending the opposition or offending a foreign country. And Reagan had the right instincts. And so in I'm going to give the example again, the 1984 speech to the National Convention. I gave him a draft, and he toughened it up and toughened it up and toughened it up because he was tired of getting beaten around by the Democrats. So if he wanted to get something done or something said, he would do it his way. So I'm happy that he had a mind of his own, and whether it was domestic policy or foreign policy or political policy, he got done what he wanted to get done.
Ken, I've got to ask you, who came up with a line that he used in the 84 debate with Mondale when he was being pushed about his age, that he would not let age become a factor in the inexperience of his opponent, which has to be one of the greatest lines in presidential debates we've ever had?
I'll let you in on a secret. That was Ronald Reagan.
Was it
in the speech? Was it a planned thing, or did he come up with it on the fly?
I think he was thinking that. I think he had that up his sleeve somewhere. Maybe he thought about it on the airplane. Maybe he thought about it in the green room. Who knew? He knew that question was going to be asked, and he said I'd been thinking about it and thinking about it. He had just had an idea, just popped into his head, and so he had that ace up his sleeve. No one gave that to him. That was the Gipper himself.
Ken, so you had a great opportunity to take credit for that right there. I mean, that was and you.
I'm not taking credit for. I've never tried to take credit for anything I didn't write.
Let me ask you too. Nuclear war was a consideration. We had a big peacenik movement going in our country that wanted to disarm, which we all know that's the way to scare somebody that's got weapons away.
He never fell for that.
But he met that challenge and actually played a high stakes poker game with the Russians. with the Strategic Defense Initiative.
Yes.
Some people named it Star Wars at the time.
Star Wars, yeah.
But he scared the Russians to death that we could take war to space. We had the technology to do it, and they buckled, and eventually, I think, was one of the reasons the entire Soviet Union fell apart.
We worked that into. I came in to help him with his State of the Union in 1987. And we made sure that SDI was going to be a strong element of that speech. He was very much a strong proponent of the Strategic Defense Initiative because he felt that if you had that defense shield and you would make nuclear weapons totally inoperable. So it was the ultimate. It was the ultimate peace weapon, and how could anyone criticize the fact that you could destroy nuclear weapons way up in the atmosphere where they could do no damage to anyone? So he was such a proponent of that, and he felt like if you had a good strategic defense initiative and you had that defense weaponry, that the other side would never ever want to start a war. And that was the ultimate peace initiative. Sounds good to me.
Yeah, it beat the other strategy we had where we shoot each other, the mutual assured destruction. I mean, it was mad in a lot of ways. Yeah. It was a total shift to that. But
that was the notion of the 60s, right?
We'll come back. We'll finish our conversation. The book is Behind Closed Doors in the Room with Reagan and Nixon. It's available now when Rick and Bubba University, the podcast continues.
This is the Rick and Bubba Show. Watch more at blazetv.com/Rick and Bubba.
Rick and Bubba, Rick and Bubba.
Welcome back to Rick and Bubba University, the podcast. We only have about 10 more minutes with Ken Khachigian. Ken has written the book Behind Closed Doors. He taught us how to say his last name back like we're sneezing. It's been fascinating to talk to you, Ken, and with you being a speechwriter for Nixon, Reagan, you were in the room when both of them talked in 1990 after they were done. We have at least two more questions. Tear down this wall. Calling the Soviet Union evil, those were also moments that we see historically that as you call them, the softies and the staff were trying to tone down his rhetoric. Reagan did them both. Were you part of that when they were trying to get him not to say those things?
No, I was not. I was not involved. On the Evil Empire, actually, that was early on. When I was in the White House, at an early time, one of the speechwriters wanted to slip that into the speech, and it was just not appropriate in an early part of the relationship because Reagan himself didn't feel that it was time to especially after his assassination attempt.
Right.
He didn't feel he had a different feeling that he didn't want to set some antagonistic rhetoric towards the Soviet Union. Yeah. But later on in his presidency, he did feel it was appropriate when the Soviets were acting in very adversarial ways. And when that language was floated up there, the conflict was always with the State Department and to some extent with the National Security Council, but almost always with the State Department. And the same thing with going to the Berlin Wall. And I happen to know in that case, the speechwriter Peter Robinson was always trying to defend his language against attempts by the State Department, which was worried about upsetting the Russians and upsetting Gorbachev. And George Shultz was pretty much much more moderate in those days, and he was working on Reagan for getting negotiations moving forward, and he thought that would antagonize Gorbachev. And yet, I think honestly, I thought Reagan saw there was a drama, time for some dramatic action at the wall, and that if anybody was going to stand there and get the Russians to do something and make a big change and speak to the world, if anyone was going to do it, it was him. That no one else was going to have the courage to do it, and he was not going to move. So I'm glad that they finally prevailed.
Let me ask you down that same line. Reagan's adversaries in the Soviet Union were, for the most part, they were cold and stiff, and they looked old, and they looked like the evil empire. And when Gorbachev came along, he was more of a PR guy. And, of course, the liberals were just, they couldn't get enough of him. And I thought it was, I thought he made I think even more so, it was a great move to take him on in a PR department and say, look, if you're for all this openness, if you're for glasnost or whatever the Russian word was for it, put action to it, tear down this wall. And I thought he met that PR challenge beautifully by demanding action over language.
Yeah, you just can't talk about it. We just can't have these glad handing at all these Geneva summits and fireside chats. And they were going, they were making trips to Disneyland and having all these PR visits with the first ladies and all that stuff. And it was all looking good. So if you're going to do something very serious and do something more instead of public relations, one thing you could do is something really serious and send a signal to freedom-loving people who were behind that wall and had relatives on one side and others on the other side, and that wall stood for oppression and lack of freedom. Then that was something you could do to actually prove what you meant.
Was Gorbachev actually insulted when he came and stayed with Reagan? I heard a story that when he came to his ranch in California, Gorbachev was used to these palaces, and he couldn't believe how simplistic that Reagan's ranch was, and was somewhat insulted by it. Is that true?
I don't know that. I don't know the facts of that, but it probably sounds true. He was probably more used to the presidential suite at the Century Plaza than that little shack up at the Santa Barbara Ranch. That I only went up. Reagan didn't like to show that staff. I only got there once in the whole presidency, and Reagan showed me all his own handiwork. He loved to show people how he laid the floors himself and he did the woodwork on it himself, and that's when he could escape the burdens of the presidency, the burdens of having people tell him what to do, and he just loved being up there so much. But it was just very plain place. It was just like a little cabin. It wasn't very luxurious at all.
No, yeah, I mean, very expensive acreage, obviously, but the home itself was very, very modest. We only have about 2 minutes, but I want to ask you, were you ever there long enough, or you had already gone? Did you see in 90, when you saw him with Nixon, did you see the Alzheimer's creeping in?
No, not in the presidency. I was with him right up to the end, worked on that 88 farewell speech to the convention. And he was very sharp, edited it very heavily, made a lot of changes. I was with him when the two presidents met together. I call it the Lions Gather. And they were both of them were real sharp. The very first time, Rick and Bubba, that I saw any slippage was in 1992, which was 2 years before he announced he had Alzheimer's. I was at a fundraising event there in Southern California, and I went up to see him, and it's the first time he ever looked at me, and for a minute, for just a second, had a blank look on his face. Mm-hmm. He couldn't remember my name.
Yes,
and so
all the way up to 92, he was pretty sharp. And
that was four years after he left the presidency, and then 2 years later, he declared he had Alzheimer's. And then I saw him again in 1996 after he had the disease. When I took Senator Dole, I was running Senator Dole's campaign for the presidency, and we took him in for a courtesy call. And he looked great, but his mind was sad. It was so sad his mind was gone.
Yeah. Bubba and I both have been through it with our parents, and we've looked in the face of that horrible disease, no doubt. Ken, thank you so much for being with us. Again, the book is Behind Closed Doors, in the Room with Reagan and Nixon. I really think we're at a crossroads again as a nation, and I think this book it's interesting just because of history, but it's more than interesting now. It's important. It's a resource for us to look at with a nation that's got a big decision coming up.
Yeah, I hope folks will go to my website, which is www.reaganandnixon.com, www.reaganandnixon.com. It's all one word, and there's a lot more information in there, and they're going to enjoy reading all these stories. I kept real close diaries and close notes and stuff in there nobody else ever had. I didn't ghostwrite the book. It's not ghostwritten. It's all there, stuff nobody else has ever seen.
From the man who was on the front line, ReaganandNixon.com. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Ken.
And thanks to each and every one of you for being with us on this edition of Rick and Bubba University, the podcast.